In the gray dawn of May 27, 1941, somewhere in the stormy North Atlantic, a wounded giant awaited its executioners. The German battleship Bismarck, over 50,000 tons of steel, armor, and firepower, had terrorized the Royal Navy for 3 days. She had destroyed the most famous warship in the world in under 3 minutes. She had killed 1,400 men with a single salvo. She had humiliated the greatest naval power on Earth. Now, with her rudders jammed and her fate sealed, she could do nothing but wait for the British battleships closing through the morning haze. What followed would be one of the most extraordinary naval actions in history. 100 minutes of sustained bombardment that would end the age of the battleship and reshape the course of the Second World War. But to understand how the mightiest warship in the Atlantic came to die, alone and helpless, 300 miles from the French coast, we need to go back 6 days, to a narrow strait of icy water between Iceland and Greenland, and to a decision that would haunt Winston Churchill for the rest of his life. By May 1941, Britain stood on the edge of the abyss. The German Blitz had devastated her cities. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies over occupied Europe. And in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, a silent war of attrition was slowly strangling the island nation. Britain imported more than half her food, nearly all her oil, the raw materials for her factories, the weapons for her soldiers, the fuel for her ships and aircraft. Everything came across 3,000 miles of ocean, in slow-moving convoys of merchant vessels. German U-boats were sinking those ships faster than British yards could replace them. In the first months of 1941, the submarines were destroying over 300,000 tons of shipping every month. Churchill later confessed that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. But the submarines weren't the only threat. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, had developed an audacious strategy. German surface raiders, battleships, and heavy cruisers would break into the Atlantic shipping lanes. Unlike submarines, which could only sink one ship at a time, a single battleship could scatter an entire convoy, leaving dozens of merchantmen easy prey. In early 1941, the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had proven the concept brilliantly, sinking 22 Allied ships in a 2-month rampage across the Atlantic. That operation had been commanded by Admiral Günther Lütjens, a meticulous, ice-cold professional who would soon be entrusted with an even more dangerous mission. Raeder's new plan was called Operation Rheinübung, and at its heart was the most powerful warship Germany had ever built. The Bismarck was a masterpiece of naval engineering. Laid down at the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg in 1936, she was designed from the start to be the most formidable capital ship afloat. Her statistics were staggering: 251 meters in length, longer than 2 football pitches, a beam of 36 meters, and a displacement fully loaded of over 50,000 tons, making her the largest warship ever built by a European power. Her main armament consisted of 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, capable of hurling 1,800-pound shells over 20 miles. Her secondary battery of 12 6-inch guns could devastate any cruiser foolish enough to close range. And her anti-aircraft suite bristled with guns of every caliber. But Bismarck's true strength lay in her armor. Her main belt was 12.5 inches of Krupp-cemented steel, thick enough to stop any shell then in service. Her armored deck, her turrets, her conning tower, all were protected by layers of hardened steel that made her, in the judgment of her designers, virtually unsinkable. 2,200 men would sail aboard her for Operation Rheinübung. Among them were prize crews for the merchant ships they expected to capture, film crews to document their triumphs, and the staff of Admiral Lütjens himself, who would command the operation from Bismarck's bridge. At 47, Captain Ernst Lindemann knew his ship better than any man alive. He'd overseen her final construction and sea trials. He'd trained her crew until they could fight her in their sleep. He believed, with some justification, that Bismarck was the finest warship in the world. Admiral Lütjens was less optimistic. Cautious by nature, he'd requested permission to delay the operation until the damaged Scharnhorst could join them, or until Bismarck's sister ship Tirpitz completed her trials. Grand Admiral Raeder refused. The invasion of the Soviet Union was imminent. After that, all resources would flow eastward. This was the Kriegsmarine's last chance to prove the value of its surface fleet. On May 18, 1941, Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen slipped their moorings and headed north. The British knew they were coming. Ultra-intelligence, the top-secret decryption of German Enigma messages, had warned the Admiralty that a major sortie was imminent. Aerial reconnaissance spotted the two German ships in a Norwegian fjord. When they disappeared northward, the alarm went out to every Royal Navy vessel in the North Atlantic. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland hoisted his flag aboard HMS Hood and steamed to intercept. Hood was, quite simply, the most famous warship in the world. For 2 decades after her commissioning in 1920, she'd been the largest and most powerful vessel afloat. 860 feet of elegant menace, capable of 32 knots, armed with 8 15-inch guns identical in caliber to Bismarck's own. She'd circumnavigated the globe, shown the flag in every major port, and become the very symbol of British naval supremacy. Sailors called her the Mighty Hood. To a generation of Britons, she was the living embodiment of their empire's power. But Hood had a secret. Designed in the aftermath of the Battle of Jutland, she was a battlecruiser, built for speed rather than protection. Her belt armor was adequate, but her deck armor was dangerously thin, only 3 inches in most places. In an era when long-range gunnery meant shells would plunge down from above, this was a critical weakness. A refit scheduled for 1939 would have doubled her deck protection. The outbreak of war canceled it. Accompanying Hood was HMS Prince of Wales, a brand-new King George V-class battleship. She was still so fresh from the shipyard that civilian contractors remained aboard, working to fix persistent mechanical problems with her main armament. Her crew had never fought a battle. Against them sailed the most modern battleship in the Atlantic, commanded by the most experienced surface raider in the German Navy, supported by a heavy cruiser with 8 8-inch guns. In the early hours of May 24th, the two forces entered the Denmark Strait, a narrow passage between the ice fields of Greenland and the minefields of Iceland. The first shots came at 5:52 in the morning. Hood's 15-inch guns bellowed across 17 miles of gray water, but her initial salvos were aimed at the wrong target. In the dim light and spray, her gunners had mistaken the sleek Prinz Eugen for the larger Bismarck. Admiral Holland immediately ordered a course change, but the damage was done. Precious seconds had been lost. Bismarck's gunnery officer, Adalbert Schneider, had no such confusion. His first ranging shots bracketed Hood immediately. At 5:55, Captain Lindemann took matters into his own hands. Frustrated by Admiral Lutjence's hesitation to engage British warships, he turned to the bridge crew and declared, "I will not allow my ship to be shot out from under me. Permission to open fire." Both German ships trained their guns on Hood. At 5:58, Prinz Eugen's 8-inch shells struck Hood's boat deck, igniting ready-use ammunition. Flames leaped up around her mainmast, but the British battlecruiser pressed on, her forward turrets still blazing defiance. At 6 o'clock precisely, Bismarck fired her 5th salvo. What happened next would be debated for decades. At least one 15-inch shell from that salvo struck Hood between her mainmast and her after turret. It penetrated her thin deck armor, plunged down through multiple decks, and reached her after magazine, where over 100 tons of cordite propellant charges waited to feed her hungry guns. The detonation was instantaneous and catastrophic. A pillar of flame shot hundreds of feet into the sky. Both after turrets, each weighing over 1,000 tons, were blown completely off the ship. Hood's back broke. Her stern section sank immediately. Her bow rose vertically out of the water, hung there for a moment as if in final salute, and then slid beneath the waves. From first hit to final sinking, approximately 3 minutes. On the compass platform, ordinary signalman Ted Briggs felt the deck tilt beneath him. Through the shattered windows he could see only sky. The Hood was rolling over. He scrambled out and found himself in the freezing water, being sucked down by the sinking ship. Then, something miraculous happened. A bubble of escaping air shot him back to the surface. He gasped, looked around, and saw nothing but wreckage and oil. Of the 1,418 men who'd stood at their battle stations aboard HMS Hood that morning, only 3 survived: Ted Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William Dundas. They were rescued hours later by the destroyer HMS Electra, singing "Roll Out the Barrel" to keep each other conscious in the freezing water. The rest, including Vice Admiral Holland and Captain Ralph Kerr, went down with their ship in the greatest single-ship loss in Royal Navy history. The news reached London within the hour. Winston Churchill was in bed at Chequers when he received the telephone call. He listened in silence, then put down the receiver. "Hood has blown up," he said quietly. It was one of the few times during the war that his closest aides saw him visibly shaken. But Churchill wasn't a man to mourn when there was vengeance to be had. His orders to the Admiralty were brutally simple: sink the Bismarck. What followed was the largest naval manhunt in history. Within hours, the Royal Navy had deployed 6 battleships and battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers, over 40 warships in all, converging on the North Atlantic from every direction. The hunt was on. But Bismarck wasn't unscathed. HMS Prince of Wales, despite her mechanical troubles, had scored 3 hits during the Denmark Strait action. One shell had punched through Bismarck's bow, flooding compartments forward and cutting off access to 1,000 tons of fuel oil. The German battleship was now trailing a telltale slick of oil and had lost 2 knots of speed. Admiral Lutyens faced a critical decision. He could turn back to Norway, running the gauntlet of British forces massing behind him, or he could press on to the French port of Saint-Nazaire, the only dock in German-controlled Europe large enough to repair Bismarck. He chose France. It was a fateful decision, and Captain Lindemann disagreed with it bitterly. The 2 officers barely spoke for the rest of the voyage. Survivors later described the atmosphere on the bridge as dicke Luft, a thick and poisonous tension. That evening, Lutyens ordered Prince Eugen to break away and continue commerce raiding independently. Bismarck turned briefly to cover her escape, then resumed her course southeast, toward France and safety. British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk tracked her through the darkness, their radar keeping the wounded battleship in constant contact. Everything depended on maintaining that contact until the pursuing battleships could catch up. Shortly after 3 o'clock on the morning of May 25th, Bismarck vanished. Admiral Lutyens had executed a wide circular maneuver, slipping behind his pursuers in the darkness and foul weather. When dawn broke, the British cruiser's radar screens were empty. Bismarck had escaped. But then Lutyens made a catastrophic error. Believing incorrectly that British radar was still tracking him, he broke radio silence to send a lengthy transmission to Germany. His signal was intercepted by British direction-finding stations, which triangulated his position and calculated his course. Bismarck was heading for France. The Admiralty redirected every available ship. Force H, steaming north from Gibraltar, was perfectly positioned to intercept. Aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Royal, 15 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers began preparing for launch. At 10:30 on the morning of May 26th, a Coastal Command Catalina flying boat spotted an oil slick trailing across the gray Atlantic. Following it to its source, the crew found themselves looking down at the massive gray silhouette of the Bismarck, plowing steadily toward France. The hunters had found their prey. The Fairey Swordfish was, by any objective measure, an obsolete aircraft. A fabric-covered biplane with fixed landing gear and an open cockpit, it looked like something from the previous war. Its maximum speed of 139 miles per hour was slower than many civilian automobiles. Its crews called it the string bag, not because of its maze of struts and wires, but because, like a housewife's string shopping bag, it could carry almost anything. But the Swordfish had qualities that didn't appear in the specifications. It could fly in weather that would ground any modern aircraft. Its fabric skin could absorb damage that would destroy metal-skinned planes, and its torpedo could be delivered with extraordinary precision by pilots flying just 50 feet above the waves. On the afternoon of May 26th, 15 Swordfish lifted off from Royal's pitching deck into a Force 8 gale. The conditions were appalling. Winds gusted to 50 miles per hour. Driving rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. The carrier's deck was rising and falling 60 feet with each wave. Several aircraft staggered off the edge of the deck and dropped toward the sea before their engines bit and pulled them back into the sky. The first attack ended in disaster, but not for the Germans. Mistaking the British cruiser HMS Sheffield for Bismarck, the Swordfish pilots released their torpedoes at a friendly ship. Fortunately, the magnetic detonators malfunctioned, and Sheffield escaped unharmed. The pilots returned to Ark Royal, reloaded with contact-fused torpedoes, and launched again into the gathering darkness. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffett of 818 Naval Air Squadron would later describe the attack as the most terrifying experience of his life. His observer, crouched in the rear cockpit, actually leaned out of the aircraft with his head beneath the wing to gauge the height of the waves. They were flying so low that spray was lashing the fuselage. Bismarck threw up a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Her gunners had never trained to engage such slow targets, and their fire control computers kept overshooting. But steel was still filling the air, and Moffat's Swordfish was hit over 100 times. At 7:47 in the evening, he released his torpedo. The 18-inch warhead struck Bismarck's stern on the port side, directly against her rudder. The explosion jammed both rudders at 12 degrees to port. The steering gear was wrecked. The compartment flooded. Bismarck could no longer steer. Every attempt to correct her course failed. Using differential propeller thrust, running the port screws faster than the starboard, worked briefly, but the gale force winds and heavy seas kept pushing her bow back around. She could only steam in great, helpless circles. At 11:40 that night, Admiral Lütjens sent his final message to Germany. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The crew, exhausted from days of combat and pursuit, understood what that meant. Their admiral wasn't promising them rescue. He was preparing them to die. Captain Lindemann, according to survivors, tried to restore morale with a more optimistic speech. Help was coming, he said. U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers would arrive at dawn. But the men knew the truth. The British battleships were closing. By morning, it would be over. Through the long night, British destroyers circled like wolves, making torpedo runs in the darkness, keeping Bismarck's crew at battle stations, denying them any rest. The Polish destroyer Pierun charged in repeatedly, her captain flashing, "I am a Pole," in Morse code between salvos. Not a single destroyer torpedo found its mark, but the harassment was relentless. When dawn broke on May 27th, Bismarck's crew had been awake for nearly 40 hours. At 8:43 in the morning, lookouts aboard HMS King George V spotted Bismarck through the mist. Admiral John Tovey, commander-in-chief of the Home Fleet, had positioned his force carefully. King George V, his flagship, approached from the north. The battleship Rodney came from the northwest. Together they carried 19 heavy guns against Bismarck's 8. Rodney fired first, at 8:47. Her 9 16-inch guns, the largest in the Royal Navy, sent their first salvo screaming toward the crippled German battleship. King George V opened fire 1 minute later. Bismarck replied immediately. Her forward turret still worked, and her 5th salvo straddled Rodney, the closest she came to scoring a hit. But she was firing blind, without her main rangefinders, against 2 targets approaching from different angles. Her gunners never found the range. At 9:02, the battle effectively ended. A 16-inch salvo from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward superstructure, destroying the main fire control director, and killing most of the senior officers on the bridge. Both forward turrets, Anton and Bruno, were put out of action within minutes. Fire control shifted to the after station, commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Burkhard von Mühlenheim-Reckberg, the 4th gunnery officer. He managed to direct only 4 salvos before another shell destroyed his station as well. By 9:31, all 4 of Bismarck's main turrets were silent. Her guns would never fire again. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an execution. With Bismarck defenseless, Rodney closed to 3,000 yards, point-blank range for naval guns, and continued firing into her superstructure at a rate of nearly 2 salvos per minute. King George V pounded her from the other side. The heavy cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire added their 8-inch guns to the carnage. Inside Bismarck, the scenes were apocalyptic. Shells were penetrating the upper decks and exploding among the crew compartments. One shell struck the aft canteen, killing First Officer Hans Oyles and over 100 men who'd gathered there. The ship was burning from bow to stern. In the engine rooms, Engineering Officer Gerhard Junak received the order to scuttle. He set demolition charges with 9-minute fuses, then ordered his men topside. Those who could still move began climbing through smoke-filled passageways toward the open air. Mühlenheim-Reckberg, trapped in his armored after-control position, finally managed to force open the hatch. he emerged onto a scene of devastation. The deck was torn and buckled, bodies lay everywhere, and fire was consuming the superstructure. He gathered a group of survivors and led them toward the stern. "There's still time," he told them. "We're sinking slowly. The sea is running high and we'll have to swim a long time, so it's best we jump as late as possible. I'll tell you when." At 10:20, Admiral Tovey ordered his battleships to disengage. Their fuel was running critically low. They'd been at sea for days, and they still had to fight their way home through waters infested with U-boats. But Bismarck was clearly finished. Listing heavily to port, her guns silent, fires raging along her entire length, the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire moved in to finish the job. Captain Benjamin Martin circled the dying battleship, firing 2 torpedoes into her starboard side and 1 into her port. The last struck below the waterline, near the already flooded stern sections. At 10:35, Bismarck began to capsize. Müllenheim-Rechberg watched from the water as the ship he'd served rolled slowly onto her beam ends. Her battle flag was still flying. For a moment she hung there, her keel visible, air and steam escaping from countless openings in her hull. Then, with a deep groaning sound, she slid beneath the waves, stern first. The time was 10:39. The Bismarck was gone. In the water around the sinking, perhaps 800 men struggled for their lives. The sea was rough, the water was cold, and many were already wounded. They clung to debris, to each other, to anything that would float. They called out for rescue, their voices carrying across the gray water to the British ships circling nearby. Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori lowered scrambling nets and began pulling survivors aboard. The work was slow. Each man had to be hauled up individually, slick with oil, often too weak to climb. Midshipman Joe Brooks of Dorsetshire actually jumped into the water to help wounded Germans reach the ropes. One man had lost both arms and was trying to hold on with his teeth. Brooks fought to save him but couldn't. 86 men had been pulled from the sea when, at 11:40, a lookout on Dorsetshire spotted what he believed was a submarine periscope. The alarm was sounded. Both ships immediately increased speed and pulled away, their propellers churning through the mass of swimming men. Müllenheim-Rechberg, already safely aboard Dorsetshire, watched from the deck as hundreds of his shipmates, men he'd served with, trained with, fought beside, disappeared astern. Their cries faded into the wind. Not one of them was ever seen again. Of the 2,200 men who'd sailed aboard Bismarck, 115 survived. The dead included Admiral Gunther Lütjens, who almost certainly died when shells destroyed the bridge in the opening minutes of the final battle. His body was never recovered. Captain Ernst Lindemann went down with his ship. Some survivors reported seeing him on the forecastle as Bismarck capsized, making no attempt to save himself. He'd refused to abandon the vessel he'd built and commanded. The 3 men rescued by German vessels, U-74 picked up 3 survivors that evening, and the weather ship Sachsenwald found 2 more the following day, brought the total to 116. One man died of his wounds aboard Dorsetshire and was buried at sea with full military honors, leaving 115 who lived to tell the story. Among them was Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg, who would later write the definitive survivor's account of the voyage. He remained a prisoner of war until 1947, then joined the West German diplomatic service, eventually serving as his country's ambassador to several nations. He never forgot the moment the rescue ships pulled away. There were hundreds of them, he wrote decades later, hundreds of yellow life jackets, perhaps 800, I estimated. It would take a good while to get them all on board. That they would all be saved, I had no doubt. He was wrong. The destruction of Bismarck sent shockwaves through both nations. In Britain, the victory was celebrated as proof that the Royal Navy still ruled the waves. The shame of Hood's loss was avenged. Churchill used the triumph to demonstrate British resolve to the watching Americans, whom he desperately needed to enter the war. Admiral John Tovey, who'd commanded the final action, offered a generous tribute. The Bismarck had put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy, and she went down with her colors flying. In Germany, the impact was devastating. Hitler was reported to be agitated and upset when he received the news. His already limited confidence in the Kriegsmarine collapsed entirely. In a furious meeting with Grand Admiral Raeder, he demanded to know why Lütjens hadn't pursued and destroyed the damaged Prince of Wales after sinking Hood. He declared the surface fleet utterly useless. From that day forward, Hitler forbade any further surface ship sorties into the Atlantic. The strategic consequences were profound. Bismarck's sister ship Tirpitz, the most powerful battleship remaining in German hands, was sent to Norway in January 1942. There she remained for the rest of the war, moored in remote fjords, protected by nets and smoke screens, achieving almost nothing. Her mere presence, the threat she represented, forced the Royal Navy to keep powerful forces in home waters to guard against a breakout that never came. In July 1942, the fear of Tirpitz caused the escort of convoy PQ-17 to scatter, leaving the merchant ships defenseless. U-boats and aircraft slaughtered them. 24 ships lost, the worst convoy disaster of the war. But Tirpitz herself fired her main guns in anger exactly once, bombarding weather stations on Spitsbergen. In November 1944, she was finally destroyed by RAF Lancaster bombers carrying 12,000-pound tallboy earthquake bombs. Nearly 1,000 of her crew died. She'd spent 3 years of the war hiding from a battle she was never permitted to fight. Scharnhorst lasted longer at sea. She too was sent to Norway, where she participated in occasional coastal operations until December 1943. That month she was caught by HMS Duke of York and escorting cruisers at the Battle of the North Cape. She was sunk with the loss of nearly 2,000 men. Only 36 survived. Gneisenau never fought again. Badly damaged by British bombing, she was decommissioned and eventually scuttled. The age of the battleship was ending. Bismarck, for all her size, her armor, her fearsome guns, had been crippled not by enemy battleships, but by 15 obsolete biplanes. The Swordfish that sealed her fate flew slower than the wind that carried them into battle. Their torpedoes were primitive weapons, almost unchanged since the First World War. Yet one of those torpedoes, delivered through driving rain and murderous anti-aircraft fire by a pilot flying 50 feet above the waves, had rendered the most powerful warship in the Atlantic completely helpless. The lesson wasn't lost on naval planners. 6 months after Bismarck sank, Japanese carrier aircraft would devastate the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. 3 days after that, Swordfish from HMS Ark Royal's sister ships would help sink the Japanese battleship's counterparts in the Far East. The future of naval warfare belonged to the aircraft carrier. Germany's surface fleet, which had absorbed billions of Reichsmarks and thousands of skilled workers, would spend the rest of the war cowering in Norwegian fjords, a monument to strategic miscalculation. The resources used to build Bismarck alone could have produced dozens of U-boats, the weapons that had actually come close to strangling Britain. Grand Admiral Raeder was forced to resign in January 1943, replaced by the U-boat commander Karl Dönitz. Hitler's fury at his surface fleet never abated. He eventually ordered every remaining capital ship scrapped, an order that Dönitz managed to delay until the war's end made it irrelevant. The wreck of the Bismarck was discovered in June 1989, resting in 15,000 feet of water on the slopes of an extinct undersea volcano. Oceanographer Robert Ballard, who'd found the Titanic 4 years earlier, led the expedition. The photographs and video he brought back showed a ship that remained remarkably intact despite her violent end. Her hull largely undamaged below the waterline, her massive turrets torn from their barbettes and lying nearby on the ocean floor. The evidence supported what German survivors had always maintained. Bismarck's armor had held. Not a single British shell had penetrated her main belt or armored deck. She'd been battered into a burning wreck, but she hadn't been sunk by enemy action alone. The scuttling charges set by Gerhard Unach and his engineers had finished what the British had started. Bismarck went to the bottom because her own crew sent her there, denying the Royal Navy the satisfaction of claiming they'd sunk her. Whether this matters in the end is a question for historians and survivors. What matters more, perhaps, is the human cost. On the British side, 1,418 men of HMS Hood dead in seconds, with only 3 survivors to tell their tale. Ted Briggs, the last of them, died in 2008 at the age of 85. He'd spent his life as a living memorial to his lost shipmates. On the German side, over 2,000 men, most of them young sailors in their late teens and early 20s, who died in the freezing North Atlantic while rescue ships steamed away. Their average age was 21. Many had never seen combat before that week. The wreck site is now protected as a war grave. The ships that carry tourists to Titanic don't visit Bismarck. Her dead rest undisturbed, 4.5 kilometers beneath the surface, in water so cold and dark that the hull shows little sign of decay. The hunt for Bismarck lasted 8 days. The final battle lasted 100 minutes. The sinking took less than 5, but the consequences echoed through the rest of the war and beyond. Germany's surface fleet, the pride of Admiral Raeder and the terror of Allied merchant seamen, never recovered. The age of the battleship, which had dominated naval thinking for half a century, was ending. The lesson that air power could destroy armored warships, demonstrated so dramatically in those final hours of May 1941, would reshape warfare forever. And in the gray waters of the Denmark Strait, where the mighty Hood exploded and took 1,400 souls to the bottom, the sea keeps its own counsel. 3 men survived to tell that story. Now there are none. But the story endures, of hubris and courage, of technological triumph and human tragedy, of the brief, violent, unforgettable voyage of the battleship Bismarck.